My husband Luke and I were supposed to be flying to Thailand for our anniversary, except he ditched me at the gate to board a different plane with his secretary Maya. Too bad for him, because while he was getting arrested for punching a stranger who flirted with her, I was sipping champagne in first class to Bali, letting his desperate calls for bail money go straight to voicemail. 3 months. That's how long I'd been planning what was supposed to be the perfect 10th anniversary celebration. Not just any trip, a carefully orchestrated 2-week escape to Thailand that would remind us both why we fell in love in the first place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had researched every detail with the obsessive precision that made me successful in my marketing career. The boutique resort in Koh Samui with overwater bungalows, the private cooking classes in Bangkok, the sunrise hot air balloon ride over, ancient temples. I spread the itinerary across our kitchen table like a general planning a campaign, each printed page representing hours of research, comparison shopping, and dreams. The resort photos showed crystalline waters so blue they looked photoshopped, white sand beaches that stretched endlessly, and suites with infinity pools that seemed to pour directly into the ocean. I could already picture Luke and me sharing morning coffee on our private deck, the stress of his demanding job at the financial firm finally melting away. "Rose, this looks incredible," Luke had said when I first showed him the plans. Though I noticed his eyes didn't quite match his enthusiasm, he picked up the resort brochure, flipping through it with what I convinced myself was appreciation rather than distraction. "You've really outdone yourself." I beamed at the compliment, choosing to ignore how quickly he set the papers down to check his phone. Luke had always been career-focused. It's what attracted me to him initially. His ambition, his drive to succeed, the way he could command a room during client presentations. But lately, that drive seemed to consume every moment of our lives. "I know you've been stressed with the Patterson merger," I continued, gathering the papers protectively. "I thought we both needed this, just us, no work, no distractions. Remember how we used to talk about traveling the world together?" Luke nodded, already reaching for his laptop. "Absolutely. Once this deal closes, I'll have all the time in the world." That was Luke's perpetual promise. After this project, after this client, after this promotion, then we'd focus on us. I'd been hearing variations of it for 3 years now, watching our marriage gradually transform from partnership to polite cohabitation. But this trip would change everything. I was certain of it. The trip wasn't just expensive. It was an investment in us. I'd used my bonus from the successful Williams campaign, the one that had earned me recognition throughout the agency. $15,000 for 2 weeks of pure luxury, but more importantly, 2 weeks of uninterrupted time together. No conference calls during dinner, no emails answered in bed, no weekend emergencies that somehow always required Luke's immediate attention. I booked everything in my name to surprise him, the flights, the accommodations, even the special excursions. I wanted to handle every detail so he could truly disconnect. The irony of that decision would become devastatingly clear later. Every evening for weeks, I'd catch myself daydreaming about our trip. Luke and I walking hand in hand through floating markets, sharing intimate dinners under tropical stars, maybe even finally having the conversation about starting a family that we'd been postponing for the right time. Thailand would give us space to remember who we were before work consumed our lives. If I'm being honest, and this story demands complete honesty, the red flags were there long before we reached the airport. They'd been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon, but I'd become an expert at explaining them away. The late nights at the office had multiplied. Luke's phone had developed an almost magnetic pull on his attention, buzzing constantly with messages that made him smile in ways that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or client portfolios. He'd started showering immediately when he came home, changing his cologne from the woody scent I'd bought him for Christmas to something sharper, more expensive. New client. he'd explain when I noticed the cologne. Big pharmaceutical company. They're very particular about presentation. Most telling were the changes in our intimacy. Not just physical, though that had certainly diminished, but the small intimate moments that make a marriage. He'd stopped sharing the funny stories from his day, stopped asking about my projects, stopped noticing when I wore the dress he once said was his favorite. During our last dinner out before the trip, I'd watched him check his phone 6 times during appetizers alone. When I gently suggested he put it away, he'd snapped with uncharacteristic irritation. "Rose, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. This deal could make or break my career." "I know, but we're supposed to be celebrating our upcoming anniversary." "The anniversary trip you planned without asking if it was convenient timing." The words stung because they weren't entirely unfair. I had planned it as a surprise, assuming he'd be as excited as I was to escape together. His resentment caught me off guard, but I swallowed it down, convinced that once we were on the plane, once we were away from all his stressors, we'd reconnect. Love, I've learned, has a remarkable ability to rationalize the irrational. Every warning sign became something I could explain away. He was stressed, he was tired, he was going through a difficult phase at work. The thought that he might be actively deceiving me, actively planning to betray our marriage, never seriously crossed my mind. I convinced myself that my husband was struggling, not straying, that he needed my patience, not my suspicion, that our anniversary trip would be exactly the reset our marriage needed. How naive that seems now, sitting here months later, understanding exactly how carefully orchestrated his deception had been. But that morning, as I excitedly packed our suitcases and triple-checked our documents, I still believed I was saving our marriage. I had no idea I was about to discover just how far beyond saving it already was. The morning of our flight, Luke was different. Not absent or distracted as he'd been for weeks, but almost manic with nervous energy. He checked his phone obsessively, paced while drinking his coffee, and kept glancing at the clock as if he was running late for something, though our flight wasn't until afternoon. "Everything okay?" I asked, loading our suitcases into the car. "Perfect," he said too quickly. "Just eager to get this vacation started." But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he helped with the luggage. At the time, I interpreted his nervousness as excitement. Now I know he was calculating timing, making sure all his pieces were in place for the betrayal he'd been planning for months. The drive to the airport was filled with intention I couldn't name. Luke kept checking the time, his leg bouncing with barely contained energy. I chattered about our itinerary, trying to lighten the mood, but he responded with distracted nods and one-word answers. As we pulled into the departure area, Luke's phone buzzed with a text that made him smile. The first, genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. He quickly turned the screen away, but not before I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize. Maya. "Work?" I asked casually. "Always," he replied, but his tone suggested anything but work-related frustration. Within hours, I would understand exactly what that smile meant, and my carefully planned anniversary dream would become the starting point of the most devastating and empowering experience of my life. Looking back now, I realized the deception had been building for months, like a carefully constructed house of cards. Each lie was a foundation for the next, each excuse perfectly crafted to maintain the illusion that Luke was simply an overworked husband rather than an unfaithful one. The first major red flag should have been Maya herself. Luke had mentioned hiring a new secretary 3 months ago, describing her with an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate for someone whose primary job was scheduling appointments and answering phones. "She's incredibly efficient," he'd gushed, over dinner one evening. "Really understands the business, asks smart questions. She's going to be a huge asset to the team." I'd smiled supportively, genuinely happy that he'd found competent help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Luke had been struggling with his previous secretary, a woman in her 50s who treated modern technology like a foreign language. Maya, he explained, was fresh out of business school, eager to prove herself, and willing to work the long hours his demanding career required. What I didn't know then was that those long hours weren't spent in conference rooms reviewing client portfolios. They were spent in hotel bars, expensive restaurants, and eventually, each other's arms. The changes in Luke's behavior were so gradual that I adapted to each new normal without recognizing the pattern. It started with the overtime, staying late. At the office became his default rather than his exception. Weekend work sessions materialized out of nowhere, requiring his immediate attention and presence. The pharmaceutical merger is more complicated than we anticipated, he'd explain, kissing my forehead distractedly as he headed out on Saturday mornings. Maya's coming in to help me sort through the documentation. I'd watch him leave, noting how he'd started dressing better for these work sessions. Designer shirts instead of casual clothes, cologne applied with the same care he once reserved for our date nights. When I mentioned it, he had a ready explanation. Image matters in this business, Rose. You know that. Even weekend meetings require professionalism. The phone calls were another clear sign I chose to misinterpret. Luke had always been accessible to clients, but suddenly his phone became an extension of his body. It buzzed constantly with texts that made him smile secretively, calls that required privacy, and notifications that pulled his attention away from every conversation we attempted. During our movie nights, he'd excuse himself multiple times to take urgent calls in the other room. I'd hear him speaking in hushed, intimate tones that sounded nothing like his usual business voice. When I asked about it, he'd sigh with practiced frustration. Clients are demanding. They expect immediate responses regardless of the time. Accepted this explanation because I wanted to. Because questioning it would mean confronting the possibility that my marriage was dissolving while I sat obliviously in our living room, waiting for him to return from his mysterious phone calls. Perhaps, most devastating in retrospect was how Luke began treating our physical relationship like an obligation rather than an expression of love. Intimacy became scheduled, perfunctory, something to be completed and crossed off his mental checklist. He'd roll over immediately afterward, reaching for his phone to check messages. When I tried to cuddle or talk, he'd claim exhaustion, work stress, the need to prepare for early morning meetings. Our king-sized bed felt increasingly vast, with Luke maintaining careful distance even in sleep. The passionate man who once couldn't keep his hands off me had been replaced by someone who seemed to view physical contact as an inconvenience. I told myself it was temporary stress, that the demanding merger was affecting his libido. I convinced myself that our Thailand trip would rekindle the spark that was merely dormant, not dead. Luke's deception extended beyond our marriage into our social circle. He began declining invitations to gatherings with our friends, claiming work commitments or exhaustion. When we did attend events together, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and leaving early. "I'm sorry," he'd tell our hosts, "but I have an early client call tomorrow." Our friends began commenting on his absence. Evelyn, my closest friend from college, mentioned it during one of our lunch dates. "Luke seems really stressed lately. Is everything okay with the merger?" I found myself making excuses for him, defending his absence and explaining his demanding schedule. I became complicit in maintaining the illusion, protecting both his reputation and my own denial. "You know how financial work is," I'd say with a forced laugh. "Client demands don't respect personal time." Luke had always managed our joint finances, claiming his background in financial services made him better equipped to handle investments and budgeting. I trusted him completely, rarely questioning expenditures or examining bank statements in detail. But even in my willful blindness, certain expenses caught my attention. Restaurant charges at establishments we'd never visited together. Hotel bills for business trips that seemed more frequent and expensive than necessary. Jewelry purchases that never resulted in gifts for me. When I asked about the jewelry charge, nearly $2,000 at a boutique I'd admired but never shopped at, Luke had a smooth explanation ready. Client appreciation gift. The pharmaceutical. CEO's wife. Maya suggested something elegant would make a good impression. Maya again. Her name was becoming increasingly frequent in his explanations, always in a professional context, always as a helpful colleague making suggestions or assisting with client relations. I should have recognized the pattern. I should have questioned why a secretary was involved in selecting expensive gifts for clients' wives. Instead, I admired Luke's thoughtfulness and attention to client relationships. What I now understand as the most sophisticated aspect of Luke's deception was his management of time and scheduling. He created an elaborate system of fictitious meetings, imaginary client demands, and fabricated business trips that allowed him and Maya to build a relationship while maintaining the appearance of professional necessity. The Peterson Group wants to meet tomorrow evening, he'd announce casually. Dinner meeting, probably late. Don't wait up. Or, Maya and I need to fly to Denver next week. The pharmaceutical company wants a face-to-face presentation of our preliminary findings. Each lie was documented with fake calendar entries, confirmation emails he'd show me briefly, and detailed stories about client interactions that never occurred. Luke's attention to detail in constructing this false reality was remarkable and devastating. In the weeks leading up to our Thailand trip, Luke's behavior reached peak inconsistency. He'd alternate between distracted distance and forced affection, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me that our marriage was worth maintaining. Some evenings he'd bring me flowers unexpectedly, cook dinner together, or suggest watching a movie. I interpreted these gestures as signs that our relationship was healing, that the stress of work was finally subsiding. Other nights, he'd come home late with perfume on his collar that wasn't mine, with unexplained scratches on his back, with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd been thoroughly loved, just not by his wife. The morning of our departure, as I loaded our suitcases and chattered excitedly about our itinerary, Luke's nervous energy reached a fever pitch. He kept glancing at his phone, checking the time, and smiling at messages I couldn't see. "Are you excited?" I asked as we drove to the airport. "Absolutely," he replied, but his eyes were focused on the road ahead rather than our conversation. "I can't wait to get away from everything." I thought he meant work stress. I thought he meant the demands of his career. I thought he meant the pressure of the merger. I had no idea he meant me. The terminal buzzed with the familiar symphony of travel. Rolling suitcases clicking against polished floors, announcement echoes bouncing off high ceilings, the distant hum of aircraft engines promising adventures and escapes. I breathed it all in, feeling that familiar flutter of excitement that comes with impending journeys. Luke and I moved through the automatic doors together, our luggage trailing behind, us like eager companions. The departure board glowed with destinations that sounded like poetry. Bangkok, Singapore, Tokyo, Mumbai. In just a few hours, Thailand would be added to my passport, and our marriage would have its second chance. "Coffee first," I suggested, pointing toward the busy cafe near check-in. "We've got plenty of time." Luke glanced at his phone, a gesture that had become so automatic I barely registered it anymore. "Actually, I should check in with the office quickly, make sure everything's settled before we disappear for 2 weeks. I nodded understandingly, though privately I hoped this would be the last work interruption for the next 14 days. "I'll get us both lattes. Meet you back here in 10 minutes? "Perfect," he said, already walking toward a quieter section of the terminal, phone pressed to his ear. I watched him go, noting how he'd chosen a spot near the large windows where other travelers couldn't easily overhear his conversation. Professional. Discretion, I told myself. Luke had always been careful about discussing sensitive client information in public spaces. The coffee line moved with typical airport efficiency, which is to say, not at all. I found myself behind a family debating whether their toddler needed his own beverage, and ahead of a businessman who seemed to believe talking louder into his phone would improve his cell reception. While waiting, I pulled out my phone to review our itinerary one final time. The hotels I'd booked looked even more spectacular in the photos than I remembered. Our first 3 nights were at a boutique resort just outside Bangkok, followed by a transfer to the island paradise of Koh Samui. I'd planned every detail meticulously. Cooking classes with a renowned chef who'd trained in Michelin-starred restaurants, a private long-tail boat tour through hidden lagoons, couples massages overlooking the Andaman Sea. Each activity was designed to reconnect us, to remind us why we'd fallen in love, to rebuild the intimacy that work stress had gradually eroded. 2 large lattes, the barista announced, sliding the cups across the counter. I balanced them carefully, scanning the terminal for Luke's familiar silhouette. He was still by the windows, but something about his posture caught my attention. Instead of the tense, business-focused stance I'd grown accustomed to, he looked relaxed, almost animated. His free hand gestured expressively as he spoke, and I caught glimpses of genuine laughter. When had I last seen Luke laugh like that during a work call? I approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt what seemed like an important conversation, but close enough to gauge when he might finish. As I drew nearer, fragments of his conversation became audible over the terminal noise. "Can't wait either. No, she has no idea. Everything's perfect." I stopped walking. Those didn't sound like the words of someone discussing pharmaceutical, mergers or client portfolios. They sounded personal, intimate, excited in a way that had nothing to do with business. Luke's back was to me, his voice carrying a warmth and enthusiasm that I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. My chest tightened with a feeling I couldn't immediately identify. Part confusion, part suspicion, part dread. The resort. "Looks incredible. I know, I can't believe we're actually doing this." Resort? My mind struggled to process what I was hearing. Luke was discussing a resort with someone, but he was supposed to be checking in with his office about work matters. Maybe it was a client event, a company retreat I hadn't heard about. But the tone of his voice suggested something far more personal than professional obligation. Rose is completely clueless. After tonight, everything changes. The coffee cups slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the floor and splashing hot liquid across my shoes. The sound was loud enough to make nearby travelers glance over with mild concern, but Luke was too absorbed in his conversation to notice. Rose is completely clueless. My name, spoken with a casual dismissiveness that felt like a physical blow. After tonight, everything changes. I bent mechanically to clean up the spilled coffee, my mind racing to construct innocent explanations for what I'd just heard. Maybe Luke was planning a surprise addition to our trip. Maybe he'd arranged something special for our anniversary and was coordinating details with a travel agent or resort coordinator. But even as I grasped for benign interpretations, a cold certainty was settling in my stomach. The warmth in his voice wasn't the tone of someone planning a surprise for his wife. It was the voice of someone planning a betrayal. I straightened slowly, my hands shaking as I disposed of the empty cups. Luke was still talking, still animated, still completely unaware that his wife was standing 10 feet away listening to her world crumble. I've been waiting months for this. No more pretending. Finally just us. Finally just us. Not finally just the 2 of us, meaning Luke and me. Just us, meaning Luke and whoever he was speaking with. Someone who wasn't his wife. The terminal seemed to spin slightly around me as I processed the implications. Luke wasn't going to Thailand with me. He was going somewhere with someone else, leaving me behind with my carefully planned itinerary and my naive belief that we were saving our marriage. Luke ended his call and turned around, his expression immediately shifting from genuine joy to the practiced smile I'd been receiving for months. It was like watching an actor slip into character, transforming from his authentic self into the version of himself he presented to me. "Sorry about that," he said, walking toward me with manufactured casualness. "Last-minute client crisis. You know how it is." I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of guilt, any crack in his performance. But Luke had perfected his deception over months of practice. His expression showed nothing but mild work-related frustration and anticipation for our upcoming trip. "Everything resolved?" I managed to ask, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "All taken care of," he replied smoothly. "Now I can focus completely on us and our anniversary celebration." The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly that I almost admired his skill. If I hadn't overheard his conversation, I would have believed him completely. I had been believing him completely for months. "Where are the coffees?" he asked, glancing around. "I dropped them," I said truthfully. "Clumsy." Luke looked at my coffee-stained shoes and frowned with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Are you okay? You look pale." The irony of his solicitous tone, given what I'd just discovered, was almost laughable. He was asking about my well-being while actively planning to abandon me at an airport. "Just tired," I said, ready to get on the plane and start relaxing. "Absolutely," Luke agreed, checking his phone again. "Actually, I just realized I need to grab something from the duty-free shop. Travel-sized toiletries. Meet you at the gate?" Another lie, delivered with the same practiced ease. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I spoke. Luke kissed my cheek, a quick, distracted peck that felt like a performance rather than affection, and headed toward the shopping area. I watched him walk away, noting how he immediately pulled out his phone again, probably to continue the conversation I'd interrupted. Standing alone in the busy terminal, surrounded by travelers excited about their destinations, I felt completely isolated. The man I'd loved for 11 years, married for 10, planned a dream vacation with for 3 months, was about to betray me in the most calculated, cruel way imaginable, and he had no idea that I knew. I had a choice to make, and I had to make it quickly. I could confront Luke immediately, demand explanations, cause a scene in the middle of the airport. I could follow him, gather more evidence, confirm what I already knew in my heart, or I could let events unfold, see exactly how far his deception extended, and plan my response accordingly. As I stood there, still tasting the bitter residue of spilled coffee, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. The woman who had spent months making excuses for her husband's behavior, who had rationalized every red flag, who had planned an elaborate anniversary trip to save a marriage that was already dead, that woman was disappearing. In her place, something colder and infinitely more calculating was emerging. Luke thought I was clueless. He thought I would stand at this gate, waiting for him to return, completely unaware that he was about to board a different plane with another woman. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. I didn't follow Luke immediately. Instead, I positioned myself strategically near a magazine stand with a clear view of the duty-free area, pretending to browse travel guides while keeping one eye on my husband's movements. My marketing background had taught me the value of observation before action, understanding your target audience before crafting your message. Luke wasn't shopping for toiletries. He was pacing near the electronics section, phone pressed to his ear, that same animated expression I'd witnessed earlier. Even from a distance, I could see the relaxed slope of his shoulders, the easy smile, the gestures of someone completely comfortable in their deception. A family with young children passed between us, momentarily blocking my view. When they moved on, Luke had disappeared. Panic fluttered in my chest, not because I was afraid of losing him, but because I needed to know the full extent of his betrayal before I could plan my response. I moved through the duty-free section, systematically, checking each aisle like a detective following leads. I found him in the perfume section, but he wasn't alone. She was exactly what I'd expected, and nothing like I'd imagined simultaneously. Maya stood with her back to me, her long black hair cascading over a designer jacket that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Even in heels, she barely reached Luke's shoulder, and he had bent down to whisper something in her ear that made her laugh, a sound like silver bells that carried across the busy shop. Maya turned slightly, and I caught my first glimpse of her profile. She was beautiful in an obvious way, sharp cheekbones, full lips, the kind of polished perfection that suggested regular spa appointments and professional styling. She looked young, probably mid-20s, with the confident bearing of someone who had always been told she was special. Luke's hand rested possessively on the small of her back as they examined a display of expensive fragrances. They moved together with the easy familiarity of an established couple, finishing each other's sentences, sharing inside jokes, completely absorbed in each other's presence. This wasn't a new relationship. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent mistake. This was a full-blown affair, complete with public displays of affection and shared intimate moments. "What do you think of this one?" Maya asked, holding up a bottle toward Luke. "Perfect," he replied, but his eyes weren't on the perfume. They were on her face, drinking in her features with an expression of adoration that I hadn't seen directed at me in years. My stomach twisted violently as I watched my husband look at another woman the way he used to look at me. The way I'd convinced myself he still looked at me. If only I could recapture his attention, rekindle our romance, save our marriage. I forced myself to move closer, using a display of duty-free alcohol as cover. Their conversation drifted toward me in fragments that pieced together a devastating picture. "Can't believe we're actually doing this," Maya was saying, her voice breathy with excitement. "I keep thinking Rose is going to figure it out somehow." Luke chuckled, a sound that should have been reassuring coming from my husband, but instead felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "Rose is completely oblivious. She's been planning this anniversary trip for months, convinced it's going to fix our marriage. She has no idea I've been planning our escape the entire time." Our escape. The words hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been researching romantic restaurants and couples activities, Luke had been planning to leave me stranded at an airport so he could run away with his secretary. "I feel a little bad for her," Maya said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "She seems so invested in making things work." "That's Rose for you," Luke replied with casual cruelty, always trying to fix things that can't be fixed. "She'll probably wait at the gate for hours before she realizes I'm not coming back." They both laughed at this image, my husband and his mistress finding humor in my anticipated humiliation. The sound of their shared amusement over my expected devastation crystallized something cold and sharp inside my chest. "So we go through customs separately," Luke was explaining, his voice dropping to a more businesslike tone. "You take the Singapore Airlines flight to Bali. I'll meet you at the resort tomorrow evening after I handle the Rose situation." Bali. They were going to Bali, the destination I'd suggested for our anniversary before deciding on Thailand. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "What exactly are you going to tell her?" Maya asked, selecting another perfume to sample. "That there's been a family emergency. My sister in Portland, medical crisis, need to fly out immediately. Rose will be upset, but she'll understand. She always understands." His casual confidence in my predictable response was almost as infuriating as the lie itself. He knew me well enough to manipulate my compassion, to count on my supportive nature to enable his betrayal. And then what? You just disappear forever? Luke's expression grew more serious. "I've been transferring money to offshore accounts for weeks. By the time Rose realizes what's happened, we'll be set up in Bali permanently. I've already put in for a transfer to our Singapore office. Everything's arranged." The scope of his deception was staggering. This wasn't a spontaneous affair or an impulsive decision to leave. This was a methodical, calculated plan that had been months in the making. While I'd been planning our anniversary trip, Luke had been planning to steal our joint assets and abandon our marriage. "What about your joint accounts?" Maya asked, applying perfume to her wrist and offering it to Luke to smell. "Already handled," he said, inhaling her fragrance with obvious pleasure. "I've been gradually moving money to accounts she doesn't know about. The Thailand trip money, our savings, even her marketing bonus, it's all redirected. She'll be left with just her salary and whatever's in her personal checking account. My marketing bonus, the money I'd earned through months of hard work that I'd gladly spent on our anniversary trip, thinking I was investing in our future together. Luke had stolen it to fund his escape with another woman." "That seems harsh," Maya said, though she didn't sound particularly concerned. "Rose is resourceful. She'll figure something out. Besides, she's the one who let our marriage deteriorate. If she'd been more attentive, more exciting, none of this would have happened." The victim blaming was breathtaking in its audacity. According to Luke's narrative, his affair and financial theft were my fault for not being sufficiently entertaining or attentive to his needs. "When do I need to be at the gate?" Maya asked, checking her phone. 30 minutes, Luke replied. "That gives me enough time to go back to Rose, play the loving husband for a few more minutes, and then stage my emergency phone call." 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, Luke would return to me with his practiced smile and manufactured concern, pretending to be the man I'd married while preparing to abandon me in the cruelest way imaginable. "I'm nervous," Maya admitted, though she looked more excited than anxious. "Don't be," Luke said, pulling her closer. "This time tomorrow, we'll be in paradise together. No more sneaking around, no more pretending. Just us." He leaned down to kiss her, and I turned away quickly, unable to watch my husband express the passion for another woman that he'd been withholding from me for months. I walked away from the duty-free section in a daze, my mind struggling to process the full magnitude of what I'd witnessed. This wasn't just infidelity. It was theft, fraud, and emotional cruelty on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. Luke hadn't just fallen out of love with me. He actively despised me, viewing me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner he'd once promised to cherish. He'd spent months systematically dismantling our life together while presenting himself as a stressed but devoted husband. The woman I'd been 10 minutes ago, the one who believed her marriage could be saved with the right romantic gesture, had died in that duty-free shop. In her place stood someone who understood that her husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was her enemy. As I walked back toward our gate, my phone buzzed with a text from Luke. "Taking a bit longer than expected. Be there soon. Love you. Love you." 2 words that represented the pinnacle of his deception, sent while he planned to rob and abandon me. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "No rush. Take all the time you need." Because suddenly, I needed time too. Not to save our marriage. That was beyond salvation. I needed time to plan, to think, to ensure that when Luke executed his carefully crafted betrayal, he'd discover that his victim was far more formidable than he'd anticipated. The old Rose would have confronted him, demanded explanations, perhaps even begged him to reconsider. But the old Rose had just died a brutal death in the duty-free section of an international airport. The new Rose was about to be born, and she had plans of her own. I stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, travelers flowing around me like water around a stone. My mind felt split in two, part of me still the devoted wife who wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation for what I'd witnessed, while another part, cold and analytical, was already calculating the implications of Luke's betrayal. The devoted wife whispered desperate rationalities. Maybe I'd misunderstood the conversation. Maybe Maya was just a colleague helping with a surprise. Maybe there was context I was missing. This part of me wanted to approach Luke directly, give him a chance to explain, trust in the foundation of our 10-year marriage. But the analytical part of me, the strategist who had built a successful marketing career by understanding human behavior and motivation, knew better. Everything I'd witnessed aligned perfectly with the warning signs I'd been ignoring for months. Luke wasn't planning a surprise. He was planning an escape. The question wasn't whether he was betraying me. The question was what I was going to do about it. I found myself walking toward the nearest restroom, needing privacy to process what I'd learned. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on my face in the mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor of shock, the wide-eyed look of someone whose world had just shifted on its axis. But as I stared at my reflection, something remarkable happened. The devastated expression gradually hardened into something else entirely. My shoulders straightened, my jaw set with determination. The wounded wife was transforming into something far more dangerous. I thought about the months of lies, the systematic theft of our joint assets, the casual cruelty with which Luke had dismissed my attempts to save our marriage. I thought about Maya's silver bell laugh as they joked about my anticipated humiliation. I thought about Luke's confidence that I would wait helplessly at the gate while he disappeared with my money and my replacement. They thought I was predictable, passive, clueless. They were about to learn otherwise. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, my fingers moving with sudden clarity as I began documenting everything I knew. Years of managing complex marketing campaigns had taught me the value of thorough planning, and this situation demanded nothing less than campaign-level strategy. What I knew, Luke and Maya were having an affair. They planned to travel to Bali together while leaving me stranded. Luke had been systematically moving our joint assets to accounts I couldn't access. He intended to abandon our marriage permanently and establish a new life abroad. What they thought I knew? Nothing. Luke was confident in his deception, certain that I would react predictably to his staged family emergency. What advantages I had? They didn't know I was aware of their plan. All our reservations and bookings were in my name. My marketing career had given me extensive experience in crisis management and rapid response strategy. The framework was forming in my mind, not just a reaction to their betrayal, but a comprehensive response that would ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their actions. My phone buzzed with another text from Luke. Almost finished with work calls. Can't wait to start our adventure together. Love you so much. The calculated manipulation in those words, the false enthusiasm, the hollow declaration of love, crystallized my resolve. Luke thought he could continue his performance right up until the moment he abandoned me. He thought he could steal my money, break my heart, and humiliate me, all while maintaining the pretense of being a loving husband. I started typing a response, then stopped. The old Rose would have replied with matching enthusiasm, perhaps sharing her excitement about their upcoming trip. But the old Rose no longer existed. Instead, I called my best friend Evelyn. Rose, aren't you supposed to be boarding soon? Evelyn's cheerful voice carried clearly over the airport noise. There's been a change of plans, I said carefully. I need a favor, and I need you to not ask questions right now. The tone of my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because Evelyn's response was immediate and focused. What do you need? I need you to book me a first-class ticket to Bali, leaving as soon as possible. Different airline than my original flight. Send the details to my personal email, not the joint account. There was a pause. Rose, what's going on? I'll explain. Everything later. Right now, I just need you to trust me and book that flight. Done, Evelyn said without hesitation. Anything else? Yes. I need you to contact a divorce attorney, the best one you can find. Someone who specializes in financial fraud and hidden assets. Schedule a consultation for next week. Another pause, longer this time. Rose, I know how this sounds. I'll explain everything when I get back. But right now, I need to move fast. Okay. I'm on it. Are you safe? I'm about to be, I said, and meant it. My next call was to our bank. Years of managing our joint accounts had made me familiar with all our financial products and services, including some that Luke might have forgotten about. This is Rose Mitchell. I need to place a fraud alert on all accounts associated with my social security number. The representative was helpful and efficient. Within minutes, any unusual activity on our accounts would trigger automatic freezes and notifications. Luke's careful money transfers would become significantly more complicated. My second financial move was more aggressive. I accessed our primary savings account and transferred the maximum daily amount, $50,000, to my personal checking account. It wasn't theft, it was protecting assets that Luke was actively trying to steal. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using Luke's own tactics against him. While he'd been gradually moving money to hidden accounts, I was securing what remained before he could complete his theft. Next, I began methodically canceling and modifying our Thailand reservations. Every hotel booking, every tour, every restaurant reservation, all had been made in my name with my credit card. Luke might have stolen my money, but he'd overlooked the fact that I controlled our travel arrangements. As I worked through the cancellations, I felt a cold satisfaction in imagining Luke's confusion when he tried to access accommodations that no longer existed. His carefully planned romantic getaway would become a series of closed doors and confused hotel staff. But I wasn't just canceling. I was redirecting. Some of the Thailand reservations could be modified rather than canceled. Their destinations changed to Bali. If Luke and Maya were determined to escape to paradise, they might find their accommodations unexpectedly occupied. My final preparation involved creating a comprehensive digital record of Luke's deception. I screenshot the bank transfers, documented the timeline of his lies, and began assembling evidence that would be crucial for divorce proceedings. Luke thought he'd been clever, but his systematic approach to moving our assets had created a clear paper trail. Every transfer, every hidden account, every fraudulent transaction would become evidence of his betrayal. I also changed all my important passwords: email, banking, social media, cloud storage. If Luke thought he could manipulate my digital life, after abandoning me, he was about to discover otherwise. As I completed my preparations, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control. For the first time since discovering Luke's affair, I wasn't reacting to his choices. I was making my own. The woman who had spent 3 months planning a romantic anniversary trip to save her marriage was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that some betrayals were too calculated, too cruel, too systematic to forgive. Luke wanted to abandon me at an airport? Fine. But he would discover that the woman he was abandoning wasn't the passive victim he'd imagined. My phone buzzed with Evelyn's message: first class to Bali booked. Departs in 2 hours, different terminal. Details in your personal email. Divorce attorney consultation scheduled for Tuesday. Whatever's happening, I've got your back. I smiled for the first time that day. An expression that felt foreign on my face, but absolutely right for the situation. Luke's final text came as I was preparing to move to the other terminal. Heading back to you now, so excited for our trip, just us and paradise. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my response. Can't wait to see how this turns out. It wasn't a lie. I genuinely couldn't wait to see Luke's face when he realized that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated his wife. The old Rose was dead. The new Rose was boarding a first-class flight to Bali, and she had plans of her own. I returned to our original gate with newfound clarity, settling into a seat with a perfect view of both the boarding area and the terminal walkway. Luke would Return soon, and I needed to observe his final performance with the analytical eye of someone gathering evidence rather than the wounded gaze of a betrayed wife. My phone showed 17 minutes until Maya's flight to Bali would begin boarding. Luke was cutting it close, but then again, he'd probably calculated the timing precisely to minimize his exposure to my questions and maximize his chances of a clean escape. I opened my laptop and began working, projecting the image of a wife contentedly managing last-minute emails before her romantic vacation. But my fingers weren't typing work correspondence. They were documenting everything I'd witnessed, creating a timeline of Luke's deception that would be crucial for what came next. The therapeutic value of organizing my thoughts into bullet points and chronological order surprised me. Each lie became data, each betrayal a strategic move in a game I was finally beginning to understand. Luke appeared in my peripheral vision, walking toward our gate with the confident stride of someone who believed his plan was proceeding flawlessly. He'd changed clothes. Gone was the casual shirt he'd worn to the airport, replaced by the expensive button-down I'd bought him for our last anniversary. The irony of him wearing my gift while preparing to abandon me was so perfect it felt intentional. "Sorry about that," he said, settling into the seat beside me with practiced casualness. "You know how clients can be. Last-minute panic about the Peterson merger." I looked up from my laptop, giving him the patient smile he expected. "Everything? Sorted out?" "Finally," he replied, checking his phone with what appeared to be casual interest, but I now recognized as careful timing management. "I told them not to contact me for the next 2 weeks unless someone's literally dying." Another lie, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who'd been perfecting his deception for months. I wondered how many other lies I'd accepted without question, how many times I'd been too trusting to recognize the manipulation. "That's good," I said, returning to my typing. "We both need this break." "We really do," Luke agreed, and for a moment his voice carried what sounded like genuine emotion. "Rose, I want you to know how much this trip means to me. How much you mean to me." The words should have warmed my heart. Instead, they chilled me with their calculated timing. Luke was delivering his final performance as the loving husband, creating one last memory of devotion before disappearing forever. Luke's phone rang with perfect timing, so perfect I wondered if he'd set an alarm to trigger the call. He glanced at the screen with manufactured surprise before answering. "Hello? Patricia?" His voice immediately shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" I watched his face cycle through expressions of shock, worry, and determination with the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. His free hand ran through his hair, a gesture I'd always associated with genuine stress but now recognized as theatrical. "When did this happen? Is she conscious? What are the doctors saying?" The one-sided conversation continued for several minutes, Luke asking urgent questions about his fictional sister's fictional medical emergency. I found myself almost admiring his commitment to the performance, the way he maintained perfect eye contact with me while delivering each calculated lie. "I'll be on the next flight," he said finally. "Tell her I'm coming." He ended the call and turned to me with an expression of devastated regret that would have been convincing if I hadn't known the truth. "Rose, I'm so sorry. Patricia's in the hospital, some kind of accident. She's in critical condition, and they don't know if she's going to make it." I set down my laptop, giving him my full attention. "Oh my God, Luke, what happened?" "Car accident. She's unconscious, and the doctors are saying the next 24 hours are crucial." His voice broke slightly, a masterful touch. "I have to go to Portland immediately." "Of course you do," I said, reaching for his hand with what I hoped looked like supportive understanding. "Family comes first. The trip can wait." The relief that flashed across his features was so brief I almost missed it. He'd been prepared for arguments, tears, attempts to convince him to stay or to come with him. My immediate acceptance of his fictional emergency clearly exceeded his expectations. I feel terrible about this, Luke continued, squeezing my hand with false emotion. I know how much you were looking forward to Thailand, how much work you put into planning everything. Don't you dare feel guilty about a family emergency, I replied firmly. Patricia needs you. I'll just reschedule everything for when she's better. You're incredible, he said, leaning over to kiss my forehead. I don't deserve you. The irony of that statement was so profound it took all my self-control not to laugh. He was absolutely right. He didn't deserve me. He didn't deserve my loyalty, my love, or my forgiveness. But he especially didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me crumble when I discovered his betrayal. When do you need to leave? I asked. There's a flight to Portland in 40 minutes. If I run, I can just make it. 40 minutes. Enough time for Maya to board her flight to Bali, for Luke to disappear into the crowd, and for me to be left sitting alone at our gate wondering what had happened to my marriage. Luke stood up abruptly, gathering his carry-on bag with urgent efficiency. I hate leaving you like this, but go, I insisted, standing to embrace him. Text me when you land. Give Patricia my love. He held me tightly, and for a moment I almost believed he felt genuine remorse for what he was doing. But then he pulled back, and I saw the calculation in his eyes, the relief that his plan was proceeding smoothly. I love you so much, he said, cupping my face in his hands. I'll make this up to you, I promise. I love you too, I replied, meaning it for perhaps the last time. Luke kissed me deeply, a passionate farewell that felt more like a performance than an expression of love. Then he grabbed his bag and hurried away, turning back once to wave before disappearing into the crowd of travelers. I watched him go, noting how quickly his urgent, worried pace shifted to something more relaxed once. He thought he was out of my sight. Within minutes, he'd be meeting Maya, and together they'd board their flight to paradise, confident that they'd executed the perfect escape. They had no idea that their victim had become their adversary and that their paradise was about to become something very different than they'd planned. I sat back down, pulled out my phone, and opened my boarding pass for the first-class flight to Bali. Luke thought he was going to paradise, but paradise, I was about to discover, could be exactly where you found your enemies most vulnerable. The hunt was about to begin. As Luke disappeared into the crowd with his fabricated urgency, I activated my phone and began building what marketing professionals call a competitive intelligence network. Within minutes, I had Evelyn working on flight bookings and legal consultations, but I needed more resources for what I was planning. My second call went to Carl, my former colleague who now worked in corporate security consulting. We'd collaborated on several campaigns involving crisis management, and I knew he had access to resources that could prove invaluable. Rose, aren't you supposed to be sipping Mai Tais in Thailand by now? Carl's voice was warm with genuine friendship. Change of plans. I need a favor, and it's going to sound strange. Strange is my specialty. What do you need? I need comprehensive background information on someone. Financial records, travel patterns, digital footprint. Someone who I suspect has been engaging in systematic financial fraud. There was a pause. This is about Luke, isn't it? Carl had always been perceptive. During our professional relationship, he'd occasionally made comments about Luke's behavior that I'd dismissed as jealousy or misunderstanding. Now, I wondered if he'd seen warning signs I'd been too blinded by love to recognize. Yes, and I need everything you can find within the next 6 hours. Consider it done. Send me his full name, social security number, and any account information you have access to. I'll have a complete profile by evening. While Carl worked on his intelligence gathering, I began my own forensic accounting investigation. Years of managing marketing budgets had given me a solid understanding of financial analysis, and Luke's systematic theft had left digital breadcrumbs throughout our joint accounts. I downloaded statements going back 6 months, creating spreadsheets that tracked every unusual transaction, every transfer to unknown accounts, every expenditure that didn't align with our normal spending patterns. The pattern that emerged was both comprehensive and damning. Luke hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been methodically liquidating our entire financial foundation. The Thailand trip funds were just the beginning. He'd redirected dividend payments, emptied our emergency savings, even cashed in my retirement contributions without my knowledge. But his systematic approach had also created an extensive paper trail. Every fraudulent transaction was documented, time-stamped, and traceable. Luke thought he'd been clever, but he'd actually been building the evidence that would destroy him in divorce court. My next priority was understanding Luke and Maya's exact travel arrangements. I knew they were going to Bali, but I needed specifics: airlines, hotels, planned activities, timeline. Information that would allow me to anticipate their movements and position myself strategically. I started with social media archaeology. Maya's Instagram account was public, and like most people her age, she documented her life extensively online. Scrolling through her recent posts revealed a pattern of luxury lifestyle shots: expensive restaurants, designer clothes, exotic locations, all funded, I now realized, by my stolen money. More importantly, her posts contained location data and timeline information. She'd been documenting their affair in real time, posting photos from restaurants where Luke claimed to be in business meetings, sharing images from weekend trips he'd described as work conferences. The digital evidence of their relationship was overwhelming, and Maya had helpfully created a comprehensive record of Luke's lies and my financial exploitation. Through careful analysis of our credit card statements, I identified the specific charges for Luke and Maya's Bali trip. Cross-referencing these with online booking platforms, I was able to determine their exact itinerary: flights on Singapore Airlines, accommodations at an exclusive resort in Seminyak, reservations at high-end restaurants, bookings for private tours and spa services, everything paid for with money stolen from our joint accounts. Everything booked under Luke's name, but charged to credit cards I was legally entitled to access. The beautiful irony was that Luke's desire for luxury had made him sloppy. Instead of booking modest accommodations that might have escaped my notice, he'd chosen expensive, distinctive venues that were easy to identify and track. As I worked through the evidence, I began constructing a psychological profile of both Luke and Maya, understanding their motivations, vulnerabilities, and likely responses to different scenarios. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about ensuring that any consequences they faced would be both appropriate and effective. Luke's primary driver was ego. He saw himself as sophisticated, successful, deserving of luxury and admiration. His greatest fear would be public humiliation, professional disgrace, the collapse of his carefully constructed image. Maya appeared to be motivated by status and material comfort. She'd attached herself to Luke not just for romance, but for the lifestyle he could provide. Her greatest vulnerability would be the discovery that her comfortable new life was built on stolen money and lies. Understanding their psychological profiles would be crucial for determining how to apply pressure most effectively. My marketing background had made me proficient with various digital tools and platforms, skills that were about to prove invaluable. I began systematically documenting Luke's digital deception, taking screenshots of bank transfers, downloading email communications, preserving social media evidence. But I also went on the offensive. I changed our shared passwords, secured our joint accounts, and began the process of separating our digital lives. Luke thought he could steal my money and disappear, but he'd overlooked the fact that I controlled most of our shared digital infrastructure. I also set up monitoring systems that would alert me to any attempts Luke made to access our accounts or modify our arrangements. If he tried to make additional transfers or bookings, I would know immediately. One advantage I possessed that Luke had underestimated was my professional network. Years of marketing work had connected me with people in travel, hospitality, finance, and media, connections that could prove valuable for someone planning comprehensive consequences for systematic betrayal. I reached out to contacts in the travel industry, explaining that I needed to track and potentially modify reservations made with fraudulent funds. The response was immediate and supportive. Financial fraud in travel bookings was a serious issue that professionals took seriously. Similarly, my connections in finance were able to provide guidance on asset protection and recovery strategies. Luke thought he'd been clever moving money to hidden accounts, but he'd underestimated the resources available to someone with legitimate legal standing and professional connections. As I worked through my planning, I was constantly aware of timing. Luke and Maya's flight to Bali would depart in less than 2 hours. My own first-class flight would leave shortly after. I had a narrow window to set everything in motion before we all converged in paradise. But timing would also be crucial for maximum impact. I needed to ensure that Luke's downfall occurred at moments of maximum vulnerability, when he was relaxed and confident, believing his plan had succeeded perfectly. The preliminary work was nearly complete. Evidence gathered, resources mobilized, strategy developed. Luke thought he was escaping to paradise with his stolen money and replacement wife. Instead, he was walking into the most comprehensive dismantling of his life that I could possibly orchestrate. Paradise, I was about to prove, could be exactly the wrong place to be when your victims decided to fight back. With Luke's performance complete and his emergency departure executed, I had approximately 90 minutes before my own flight to Bali. This window represented the most critical phase of my operation, setting the initial traps that would begin unraveling Luke's carefully constructed plan from the moment he believed himself safe. I gathered my belongings and moved efficiently through the terminal toward the departure gate for my first-class flight. The contrast between my current state of focused determination and the naive excitement I'd felt just hours earlier was remarkable. The woman who had planned a romantic anniversary trip no longer existed. In her place walked someone with far more dangerous intentions. My phone buzzed with updates from my newly activated support network. Carl's first intelligence report had arrived, and the information was both comprehensive and damning. Carl's preliminary findings exceeded my expectations. Luke's digital footprint revealed a pattern of deception that extended far beyond his affair with Maya. He'd been systematically preparing for his disappearance for over 4 months, creating offshore accounts, researching international banking laws, and establishing the infrastructure for a permanent relocation. More disturbing was the evidence of previous infidelities. Maya wasn't Luke's first affair. She was simply the first one he'd decided was worth abandoning his marriage for. Credit card records showed a pattern of hotel bookings, restaurant charges, and gift purchases that aligned with other relationships I'd been completely unaware of. The revelation that Luke had been serially unfaithful reframed everything I thought. I knew about our marriage. This wasn't a man who had fallen out of love with me. This was someone who had never been faithful, who had simply become more systematic about his deception over time. Armed with Carl's intelligence, I began implementing the first phase of my financial counterattack. Luke's theft of our joint assets had been methodical, but it had also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with legitimate legal standing and proper documentation. My first call was to our primary bank's fraud department. With detailed transaction records and evidence of unauthorized transfers, I was able to initiate fraud investigations on multiple accounts. This wouldn't immediately recover the stolen money, but it would freeze Luke's access to the funds he'd moved and create a legal paper trail that would be crucial for divorce proceedings. Next, I contacted the credit card companies for accounts Luke had been using to fund his escape. By reporting suspicious activity and providing evidence of fraudulent charges, I triggered automatic security holds that would prevent additional unauthorized use. The beauty of this approach was its legitimacy. I wasn't engaging in illegal activity or unethical behavior. I was simply exercising my legal rights as a joint account holder to protect assets from theft. While working on financial containment, I simultaneously began targeting Luke and Maya's travel arrangements. Through careful analysis of their booking patterns and my knowledge of Luke's preferences, I was able to identify their specific reservations and begin systematically disrupting them. My first target was their ground transportation in Bali. Luke had booked a luxury car service to transport them from the airport to their resort, a service paid for with our joint credit card. A simple call to the company, explaining that the payment method had been compromised by fraud, resulted in the immediate cancellation of their reservation. Their restaurant reservations were next. Luke had booked tables at several high-end establishments throughout Bali, again using our joint accounts. Each restaurant was contacted with reports of credit card fraud, leading to cancellations that would leave Luke and Maya scrambling for alternative dining arrangements. The cumulative effect of these disruptions wouldn't prevent their trip, but it would create constant friction and stress, transforming their romantic escape into a series of logistical nightmares. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of my counterattack involved Luke's professional reputation. Carl's research had revealed that Luke's affair with Maya violated multiple company policies, particularly regarding relationships between supervisors and subordinates, use of company resources for personal activities, and conflicts of interest. In financial management, I compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting Luke's professional misconduct, including evidence of company credit cards used for personal entertainment, business trips that were actually romantic getaways, and falsified expense reports covering his affair-related activities. This information was carefully packaged and sent anonymously to Luke's supervisor, the company's HR department, and the compliance officer responsible for investigating financial irregularities. The timing was crucial. Luke would receive these professional consequences while he was in Bali, believing himself safely beyond reach of workplace repercussions. Maya's extensive social media presence provided an unexpected opportunity for psychological warfare. Her Instagram account contained numerous photos and posts documenting their affair, many taken in locations Luke had claimed to be attending business meetings. I created anonymous accounts on multiple platforms and began systematically documenting Maya's posts with comments that highlighted the timeline of their relationship. Nothing threatening or abusive, simply factual observations that would make it impossible for either of them to maintain the fiction that their relationship was new or innocent. More importantly, I began sharing Maya's posts with wives and girlfriends of Luke's colleagues, letting them draw their own conclusions about the timeline and nature of the affair. Social pressure and professional gossip would create consequences that extended far beyond any legal proceedings. While disrupting Luke and Maya's arrangements, I simultaneously began positioning myself to occupy the spaces they thought they'd reserved exclusively. Using the same booking platforms and leveraging my legitimate access to the accounts they'd used fraudulently, I began making my own reservations at the same venues. Their romantic dinner for two at the exclusive beachfront restaurant? I booked the table next to theirs for the same evening. Their couple's spa treatment? I scheduled my own appointment immediately following theirs. Their sunset cruise for lovers? I would be on the same boat. The psychological impact of these encounters would be devastating. Instead of enjoying their romantic escape in private, Luke and Maya would find themselves constantly confronted by the woman they'd betrayed, a living reminder of the consequences of their actions. Throughout all these activities, I maintained meticulous documentation of every action I took, every conversation I had, and every piece of evidence I gathered. This wasn't just about immediate consequences. It was about building an unassailable legal case for the divorce proceedings that would follow. Luke thought he'd been clever covering his tracks, but his systematic approach to theft and deception had created an extensive evidence trail. Every fraudulent transaction, every lie told to cover his affair, every attempt to hide assets would become ammunition in the legal battle ahead. As my boarding time approached, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. That surprised me. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal just hours earlier had been devastated and reactive. The woman preparing to board a first-class flight to Bali was strategic, methodical, and in complete control. Luke and Maya thought they were escaping to paradise. Instead, they were walking into a carefully constructed web of consequences that would ensure their romantic getaway became the beginning of their downfall. The first phase of their destruction was already in motion. By the time they landed in Bali, their carefully planned escape would be unraveling in ways they couldn't anticipate or prevent. Paradise was about to become exactly the wrong place to be when your victims decided to fight back. The first class cabin of my flight to Bali felt like a war room disguised as luxury. While other passengers settled in with champagne and anticipation of tropical vacations, I transformed my spacious seat into a command center, laptop open, phone charging, documents organized with military precision. The flight attendant, a gracious woman named Layla, noticed my intense focus. "Working vacation?" she asked with a knowing smile. "Something like that," I replied, accepting the offered champagne while never taking my eyes off the screen. "Just tying up some loose ends before I can truly relax." If only she knew how accurate that statement was. The loose ends I was tying up would ensure that Luke and Maya's romantic escape became the most expensive mistake of their lives. At cruising altitude, I activated the aircraft's premium Wi-Fi and began implementing the most sophisticated phase of my operation. Using techniques I'd learned from crisis management campaigns, I established multiple monitoring systems to track Luke and Maya's movements in real time. Their social media accounts became unwitting intelligence sources. Maya's Instagram stories, posted with the narcissistic frequency of someone who believed her life was worth documenting, provided constant location updates. Luke, more cautious but equally vain, occasionally appeared in her posts, confirming their whereabouts and activities. Through airline tracking websites, I confirmed their flight had departed on schedule. They were currently somewhere over the South China Sea, probably toasting their successful escape while I assembled the architecture of their downfall 30,000 feet above the Pacific. The exclusive resort where Luke and Maya planned to celebrate their betrayal had been carefully chosen for its privacy and luxury. What Luke hadn't considered was that the same exclusivity that appealed to cheating husbands also made it incredibly easy to manipulate reservations and monitor guest activities. I contacted the resort's concierge service, identifying myself as Mrs. Mitchell, technically accurate, though soon-to-be former Mrs. Mitchell. I explained that my husband had booked accommodations for a business retreat, but there had been complications with the corporate credit card used for payment. "I need to verify the booking details and ensure everything is properly arranged," I explained to Patrick, the English-speaking concierge who seemed eager to assist a concerned wife. Within minutes, I had complete access to Luke's reservation, details, room number, dining reservations, spa appointments, even the champagne and rose petals he'd ordered for their arrival. Every romantic gesture he'd planned for Maya had been funded with stolen money, and now I knew exactly when and where each betrayal would occur. But simply knowing their itinerary wasn't enough. I needed to position myself for maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. This required a level of strategic planning that would have impressed military tacticians. I booked myself into the resort's premium villa, a accommodation tier above Luke's already expensive suite. The irony was perfect. While he celebrated stealing my money, I would be living in superior luxury just steps away from their location. More importantly, I arranged for strategic positioning throughout their stay. The romantic dinner he'd planned for their first night? I booked the adjacent table for a solo business dinner. The couple's massage appointment? I scheduled individual treatments in the same spa facility. The sunset cocktails overlooking the ocean? I would be at the nearby bar, conducting important business calls. Every romantic moment Luke had planned would be witnessed by the woman he'd betrayed, creating a psychological pressure that would transform their paradise into a psychological prison, while establishing my physical surveillance. Network, I implemented the most devastating aspect of my plan. Financial warfare that would leave Luke stranded in paradise without resources or options. The credit cards funding their romantic getaway were joint accounts that I had legitimate authority to monitor and restrict. Through carefully timed fraud alerts and security holds, I could control exactly when and where Luke's payment methods would fail. Imagine his humiliation when their romantic dinner check was declined. Picture Maya's confusion when the spa treatments couldn't be charged to their room. Consider the psychological impact when Luke discovered that his escape fund had been frozen by the very financial institutions he thought he'd outsmarted. The beauty of this approach was its legitimacy. I wasn't engaging in illegal activity. I was exercising my legal rights as a joint account holder to protect assets from fraudulent use. Luke's confidence in his escape plan had made him sloppy about communication security. Through our shared cloud storage and family phone plan, I had access to monitoring capabilities that would allow me to intercept his communications in real time. Every text message, every email, every phone call between Luke and Maya would be documented and preserved. But more importantly, I could selectively disrupt their communications at moments of maximum stress, creating paranoia and mistrust that would poison their relationship from within. When Luke tried to call his office to explain his family emergency, those calls would mysteriously fail to connect. When Maya attempted to contact friends about their romantic getaway, her messages would disappear into digital limbo. The technological failures would seem random and unfortunate, but they would systematically isolate the couple when they most needed support. The anonymous package I'd sent to Luke's employer would arrive during their second day in Bali. The timing was crucial. Luke needed to be relaxed and confident, believing his deception had succeeded when the professional consequences began to unfold. The evidence I'd compiled was comprehensive and damning. Falsified expense reports, misuse of company resources, inappropriate relationships with subordinates, and potential financial misconduct. Luke's career wouldn't just be damaged, it would be destroyed completely. But the professional destruction would extend beyond Luke. Maya's position as his secretary made her equally complicit in the company policy violations. Their romantic escape would cost both of them their careers, leaving them stranded in paradise, without jobs, income, or prospects for recovery. Understanding Luke and Maya's psychological profiles allowed me to design pressure points that would maximize their discomfort while maintaining my own plausible innocence. Luke's ego couldn't tolerate public humiliation or loss of control. Maya's materialism made her vulnerable to financial insecurity and social embarrassment. By appearing at their romantic venues as a confident, successful woman conducting important business, I would challenge Luke's narrative that I was a passive victim he could discard without consequences. My presence would force him to confront the reality that his actions had consequences, that his victim had agency, and that his carefully constructed fantasy was built on stolen foundations. For Maya, witnessing the woman she'd helped betray appearing, wealthy, confident, and apparently thriving, would shatter her justifications for the affair. She'd chosen Luke partly because he represented security and success. Seeing me flourishing while their own situation deteriorated would force her to question whether she'd chosen the winning side. As our flight began its descent into Bali, I felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with tropical vacation. Excitement. Luke and Maya's flight would land approximately 2 hours after mine, giving me time to establish my position and ensure that their arrival would be met with carefully orchestrated complications. Their luxury car service had been canceled due to credit card fraud. Their VIP airport assistants had been mysteriously reassigned. Their expedited customs processing had been flagged for additional security screening. Every convenience Luke had paid for with stolen money would evaporate, leaving them to navigate the chaos of international arrival with growing frustration and confusion. Meanwhile, I would be settling into my villa, unpacking my carefully planned wardrobe, and preparing for the most satisfying performance of my life. Luke thought he was escaping to paradise with his perfect new life. Instead, he was walking into a carefully orchestrated demonstration of what happened when you underestimated the wrong woman. Paradise was about to become the stage for the most comprehensive revenge in romantic betrayal history. Bali's tropical air hit me with the warmth of possibility as I descended from my first-class cabin. The Ngurah Rai International Airport buzzed with the excitement of tourists beginning their Indonesian adventures. But I moved through the crowds with the focused purpose of someone on a mission far more complex than vacation relaxation. My VIP, airport service, booked and paid for with my own legitimate funds, whisked me through customs and immigration with remarkable efficiency. Within 30 minutes of landing, I was settled in the back of a luxury sedan, watching the vibrant landscape of Bali scroll past while monitoring my phone for the first reports from the trap I'd set. Luke and Maya's flight was scheduled to land in 90 minutes. By then, I would be established in my villa, and the first phase of their complications would already be in motion. The Seminyak Paradise Resort exceeded even my elevated expectations. My villa, the most expensive accommodation on the property, commanded a stunning view of the Indian Ocean while providing strategic positioning to observe Luke and Maya's inferior suite. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was enjoying superior accommodations purchased with my own money while they celebrated their theft in lesser luxury. I checked in under my maiden name, Rose Manning, presenting myself as a successful marketing executive on a solo business retreat. The staff responded with the attentive service that expensive accommodations commanded, ensuring my every need would be anticipated and fulfilled. My first order of business was reconnaissance. I explored the resort grounds, identifying every restaurant, bar, spa facility, and recreation area where Luke and Maya might appear. I memorized staff schedules, learned the names of key personnel, and established myself as a valued guest whose preferences and requests should be prioritized. As I settled into my villa with a perfectly mixed mojito, my phone began buzzing with notifications that brought a smile to my face. The trap was springing exactly as planned. Luke and Maya's airport arrival had been chaos. Their luxury car service, canceled due to credit card irregularities, had left them stranded in the arrival area, while lesser transportation options were negotiated. Maya's Instagram story, posted in real time, showed her frustration as they waited for a regular taxi instead of the VIP treatment Luke had promised. But the airport complications were just the beginning. Their resort check-in had been delayed due to payment verification issues, with the credit card used for booking. While these issues were ultimately resolved, I couldn't prevent their accommodation, entirely without raising suspicions. The delays and complications had already begun the psychological erosion I'd carefully planned. My phone rang with an update from Carl, delivered with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed seeing justice served. "The package arrived at Luke's office this morning," he reported. HR opened it within an hour, and by lunch, there was a formal investigation launched. I have a contact in their compliance department who says the evidence is so comprehensive that termination is essentially guaranteed. "What about Maya?" I asked, sipping my mojito while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of revenge. Same fate. Apparently, the company has zero tolerance for supervisor-subordinate relationships that involve financial misconduct. They're both finished professionally. The timing was perfect. Luke and Maya were currently enjoying their first romantic dinner at the resort restaurant, completely unaware that their careers had just imploded 6,000 miles away. Tomorrow, they would begin receiving the phone calls and emails that would destroy their professional lives. As evening settled over Bali, the second wave of financial complications began hitting their vacation. The fraud alerts I'd triggered on their joint credit cards started activating, creating the payment failures I'd carefully orchestrated. Their romantic dinner at the resort's signature restaurant ended with embarrassment when Luke's primary credit card was declined. The backup card worked, barely, but the psychological impact was devastating. Maya's face, visible from my strategically positioned table, showed the first cracks of doubt about Luke's financial reliability. The spa appointments for the following day were automatically canceled due to payment failures. The private beach, cabana Luke had reserved for romantic sunset drinks, was released back to general availability. Each financial failure chipped away at the luxury experience he'd promised Maya, replacing romantic gestures with logistical stress. From my position at the resort, I could observe Luke and Maya's every move while remaining seemingly invisible. To them, they had no reason to suspect my presence. In their minds, I was back home, devastated and abandoned, probably crying into takeout containers while they lived their best life in paradise. Instead, I watched from the resort bar as Luke grew increasingly agitated with each payment failure. I observed from the pool area as Maya's enthusiastic social media posting gradually decreased in frequency. I documented from the beach as their romantic walks became tense conversations about money and logistics. The psychological pressure was building exactly as planned. Luke's confidence in his perfect escape was being systematically undermined by a series of failures he couldn't explain or control. As night fell, I implemented the communication interference phase of my operation. Through the shared phone plan and cloud services Luke had forgotten to modify, I began selectively disrupting their ability to contact the outside world. Luke's attempts to call his bank's customer service line mysteriously failed to connect. Maya's Instagram posts experienced unexplained upload errors. Their emails to colleagues and friends disappeared into digital limbo. The communication blackout wasn't complete. That would have been too obvious. But it was comprehensive enough to isolate them when they most needed support and information. By their second evening in paradise, the cracks in Luke and Maya's relationship were becoming visible even from my distant observation posts. The constant financial failures and communication problems were creating stress that romantic dinners and ocean views couldn't overcome. Maya, accustomed to the luxury lifestyle Luke had provided through stolen funds, was clearly frustrated by the service failures and payment problems. Luke, facing challenges he couldn't solve through charm or manipulation, was becoming increasingly desperate and irritable. Their paradise was transforming into a psychological pressure cooker, and they had no idea that the heat was being systematically increased by the woman they'd betrayed. As I retired to my villa for the evening, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the luxury accommodations or tropical setting. Luke and Maya's romantic escape was becoming exactly what I'd intended, a carefully constructed nightmare disguised as paradise. Tomorrow would bring the phone calls about their terminated employment. The day after would see their financial resources further restricted. Each subsequent day would add new complications, new stresses, new cracks in their relationship. But the masterpiece was yet to come. I had saved the most devastating revelation for when they were at their most vulnerable, most isolated, most dependent on each other for support. Luke thought he had escaped the consequences of his actions. Instead, he had walked directly into the most comprehensive demonstration of those consequences that I could possibly orchestrate. Paradise was about to become hell, and I had a front row seat to enjoy every moment of their destruction. The third morning of Luke and Maya's romantic escape dawned with the kind of tropical perfection that travel brochures promise, but rarely deliver. From my villa's private terrace, I watched the sun paint the ocean in shades of gold while sipping coffee that cost more per cup than most people's hourly wage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was living better than ever while Luke's world systematically collapsed around him. My phone buzzed with updates from the various systems I'd put in motion. The corporate investigation had accelerated overnight, with Luke's employer discovering even more evidence of financial misconduct than I'd originally provided. Carl's latest intelligence report painted a picture of complete professional destruction that exceeded my most optimistic projections. But the real masterpiece was about to begin. Luke's first indication that something was seriously wrong came at 7:23 a.m. Bali time when he received a conference call from his employer's HR department and legal counsel. I watched from my strategic position at the resort's breakfast pavilion as he took the call on the beach, his body language shifting from casual confidence to rigid tension within seconds. Through the communication monitoring systems I'd established, I could follow the conversation in real time. Luke's employer wasn't just terminating his employment, they were threatening criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal implications severe, and the timeline immediate. What do you mean effective immediately? Luke's voice carried across the beach, his professional composure cracking under pressure. I'm on a business trip. I have client obligations. Maya, lounging nearby in a bikini that probably cost more than most people's rent, looked up from her phone with growing concern. She couldn't hear the specifics of the conversation, but Luke's increasingly desperate tone was impossible to ignore. As Luke struggled with his employment crisis, the second wave of my financial warfare began hitting. With devastating precision, the credit cards funding their paradise vacation started failing systematically, each denial more humiliating than the last. Their breakfast check was declined. Their spa appointments were canceled due to payment failure. The private yacht excursion Luke had booked for that afternoon was terminated when the deposit couldn't be processed. Each financial failure was carefully timed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. From my observation post, I watched Maya's face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and finally anger as the luxury lifestyle Luke had promised crumbled in real time. She'd attached herself to him for security and status. Instead, she was discovering that both were built on stolen foundations that were rapidly dissolving. The most devastating blow came when the resort's management requested an urgent meeting with Luke regarding irregularities with the guest account. I had anticipated this moment, positioning myself in the lobby lounge where I could observe the proceedings while appearing to conduct important business calls. Patrick, the concierge who had been so helpful during my reconnaissance, approached. Luke with the polite but firm demeanor of hospitality professionals delivering unwelcome news. Maya stood beside Luke, her designer cover-up unable to hide her growing anxiety about their deteriorating situation. Mr. Mitchell, we've received notification from your credit card company regarding potential fraudulent activity on your account, Patrick explained with practiced diplomacy. Until the matter is resolved, we'll need alternative payment arrangements for your continued stay. Luke's face went through a spectacular range of emotions: shock, denial, anger, and finally a desperate attempt to maintain control. There must be some mistake. I'll call my bank immediately and sort this out. But his bank calls weren't connecting. The customer service lines I'd been selectively disrupting continued to malfunction. His attempts to resolve the crisis were systematically blocked by the very communication failures I'd orchestrated. The financial and professional crises were creating exactly the relationship pressure I'd anticipated. Maya, discovering that her luxury vacation was funded by stolen money and that her lover was professionally destroyed, began questioning every aspect of their relationship. Luke, what's really going on? She demanded as they returned to their suite after the humiliating meeting with resort management. First your job, now the credit cards. You told me everything was arranged. I couldn't hear their private conversation, but their body language was eloquent. Luke gesticulated defensively while Maya crossed her arms in the universal posture of feminine skepticism. The romantic harmony they'd displayed during their first day was replaced by the tension of two people discovering they didn't trust each other. As if employment termination and financial failure weren't enough, Luke's legal problems were about to escalate dramatically. The anonymous tip I'd provided to the authorities about his offshore accounts had triggered an investigation that was now bearing fruit. His phone rang with a call from a legal office, not his lawyer, but a prosecutor's office investigating financial crimes. The conversation was brief but devastating. Luke was being advised that criminal charges were being considered, that he should retain legal counsel immediately, and that any international travel should be reported to the court. The timing was exquisite. Luke was trapped in paradise, cut off from his resources, facing criminal charges, and discovering that his romantic escape was actually a legal nightmare. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of my plan was yet to unfold. That evening, as Luke and Maya struggled with their mounting crises, Luke received the phone call that would complete his emotional destruction. It came from the hospital in Portland where his sister Patricia was supposedly recovering from her fictional accident. The voice was professional, sympathetic, and completely fabricated, a performance by an actress friend who owed me a favor from our college theater days. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. Sarah Williams at Portland General. I'm afraid there's been a complication with your sister's condition. Her family specifically requested that you be notified immediately." Luke went pale as he listened to the detailed medical update about Patricia's deteriorating condition, her need for immediate surgery, and the family's desperate desire for him to return home immediately. The emotional manipulation was flawless. Luke was being guilt-tripped about abandoning his dying sister for a romantic vacation. The beauty of the medical emergency was that it created an impossible choice for Luke. He could return home to face his legal and professional problems while dealing with family guilt, or he could stay in paradise with Maya while his sister supposedly died without him. Maya's reaction to the family crisis was telling. Instead of offering support or suggesting they return home together, she began calculating how his departure would affect her own situation. She'd come to Bali for luxury and romance, not to support a man through family tragedy and legal difficulties. "You have to go," she said, but her tone suggested relief rather than sacrifice. I'll stay here and try to sort out the resort situation." The relationship that had been built on stolen money and mutual selfishness was fracturing under the pressure of real consequences. Luke was discovering that Maya's devotion was as shallow as his own integrity. As Luke prepared for his emergency departure, he found himself completely isolated. His employer had terminated him, his finances were frozen, his family was in crisis, and his girlfriend was abandoning him to save herself. The escape he'd planned so carefully had become a trap more sophisticated than anything he could have imagined. From my villa, I watched Luke pack his belongings with the defeated movements of a man whose perfect plan had become his perfect destruction. Paradise had become exactly what I'd intended, the stage for the most comprehensive consequences his betrayal could possibly generate. Tomorrow, he would discover that even his escape route had been compromised. The real masterpiece of my revenge was yet to be revealed. At 3:47 a.m. Bali time, my phone rang with the call I'd been anticipating for days. Luke's name appeared on the screen, the same man who had abandoned me at an airport, stolen my money, and planned to disappear forever with his secretary. Now he was calling me from paradise, and his voice carried a desperation that was music to my ears. "Rose? Thank God you answered. I need your help." I let the silence stretch for several seconds, savoring the moment when the tables had completely turned. Here was Luke, the man who thought he'd outsmarted me, reduced to begging for assistance from the woman he'd betrayed. "Luke, it's almost 4 a.m. here. Where are you calling from? I thought you were dealing with Patricia's emergency in Portland." The lie caught him off guard. I could hear him struggling to maintain his fabricated story while desperately needing my help with his real crisis. Yes, I'm still dealing with family issues, but Rose, something terrible has happened. Someone has accessed our accounts. There are problems with my job, and I'm facing some kind of investigation. I think we've been the victims of identity theft." The audacity was breathtaking. Luke was trying to frame his own theft and deception as a crime committed against us both. He wanted me to believe that we were victims together, that I should help him escape the consequences of his own actions. "Oh my God, Luke, that's terrible," I responded with perfectly performed shock and concern. "What kind of investigation? Are you safe? I don't know. My company claims I've been embezzling money, but I've never stolen anything. The credit cards aren't working, and they're saying there are irregularities with our accounts. Rose, I need you to call our bank and sort this out. You have access to everything. I almost laughed at the irony. Luke was asking me to use my legitimate account access to bail him out of the consequences of his systematic theft. He wanted me to rescue him from the very trap I'd constructed around his crimes. This is so confusing, I said, injecting my voice, with the perfect amount of bewildered concern. Let me understand this. You're in Portland with Patricia, but somehow someone has been stealing money from our accounts and framing you for embezzlement? Exactly. Rose, you're the only person I can trust right now. Everyone else thinks I'm guilty of something I didn't do. This was the moment I'd been planning for, when Luke was at his most vulnerable, most desperate, most dependent on my help. When he truly understood what it felt like to be abandoned by someone you trusted. Luke, I said softly, I have a confession to make. What do you mean? I'm not at home. I'm actually in Bali right now. Beautiful place. I'm staying at the Seminyak Paradise Resort in the premium villa overlooking the ocean. It's really quite spectacular. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could practically hear Luke's mind struggling to process what I'd just revealed. You're in Bali? Yes. I've been watching you and Maya for the past 3 days. I saw you at dinner the first night. You looked so happy together. I watched Maya sunbathe by the pool yesterday while you dealt with your employment termination. I observed your fight this morning when the resort demanded payment for your room. That's impossible. How did I know about Bali? Luke, I heard your phone conversation at the airport. I know about Maya. I know about the stolen money. I know about your plan to abandon me and start a new life. I know everything. Rose, I can explain. No need for explanations, Luke. I've spent the last 3 days documenting your theft, your affair, and your fraud. I've reported everything to the appropriate authorities. Your professional destruction? That was me. Your frozen accounts? Also me. Your sister's medical emergency? That was an actress friend of mine. The sound Luke made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. You orchestrated all of this? Every single consequence you're facing is the result of your own actions. I simply made sure you couldn't escape them. You wanted to abandon me at an airport and steal my money? Fine. But you severely underestimated who you were betraying. The beautiful irony, Luke, is that I'm living better than I ever have while your world burns around you. Maya's already planning her exit strategy. I saw her at the resort's business center booking her own flight home. She's not going to stand by you through criminal charges and financial ruin. Please, Rose, I'll do anything. Actually, there is something you can do. You can experience exactly what you plan to put me through. You can be abandoned, broke, and humiliated in a foreign country with no resources and no support. Consider it a learning experience. I ended the call and immediately blocked his number. Luke's desperate attempts to reach me would now go straight to voicemail. Messages I would never listen to, but would save as evidence of his growing panic. From my villa terrace, I watched the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of justice. Luke's punishment was complete, his betrayal fully answered. Paradise had become exactly what I'd promised, the perfect place for his perfect destruction. Luke's attempt to flee Bali became the final act of his systematic destruction. I watched from the resort's lobby as he loaded his luggage into a taxi, his movements frantic and desperate. Maya remained poolside, having already distanced herself from the sinking ship of their relationship. She'd booked her own flight home, abandoning Luke just as efficiently as he'd planned to abandon me. But Luke's escape route had been compromised long before he reached the airport. Through Carl's connections in international security, I'd ensured that Luke's name would trigger additional screening protocols. not enough to prevent travel entirely, but sufficient to create maximum stress and delay during his most vulnerable moment. At Ngurah Rai International Airport, Luke discovered that his nightmare was far from over. The anonymous reports I'd filed with international financial crime units had created a perfect storm of legal complications. Luke's attempt to leave Indonesia triggered automated alerts in multiple jurisdictions, each one adding layers of scrutiny to his departure. His passport was flagged for additional verification. His luggage underwent extensive security screening. His financial transactions were subjected to enhanced review. Each delay increased his panic while simultaneously documenting his attempts to flee prosecution. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the criminal investigation I'd initiated was gaining momentum. Federal prosecutors had discovered Luke's offshore accounts, traced his money laundering activities, and identified patterns of systematic embezzlement that extended beyond our personal assets. Luke wasn't just facing divorce proceedings, he was looking at federal prison time. While Luke struggled at the airport, the professional consequences of his actions were spreading through his industry like wildfire. Word of his termination for embezzlement had reached his professional network, destroying relationships built over decades of careful cultivation. His former clients were distancing themselves, concerned about potential legal liability from association with a suspected financial criminal. His colleagues were declining to provide references or recommendations. His professional reputation, once his greatest asset, had become his most devastating liability. The regulatory bodies governing financial services had been notified of his misconduct. His professional licenses were under review for immediate revocation. Even if he avoided criminal conviction, Luke would never work in finance again. Maya's social media presence, which had provided such valuable intelligence during my planning phase, became the vehicle for Luke's public humiliation. Her Instagram account, still public and unfiltered, contained months of evidence documenting their affair and Luke's theft of marital assets. Anonymous accounts, created and managed by my professional network, began systematically sharing Maya's posts with detailed commentary about the timeline of their relationship. Luke's theft of my money to fund romantic getaways was exposed in vivid detail, complete with location data and expense documentation. The social media campaign wasn't vindictive, it was factual. Every post was accurate, every comment was truthful, every share was legitimate. But the cumulative effect was devastating. Luke's personal life became a public case study in financial fraud and marital betrayal. The fictional medical emergency that had driven Luke to flee Bali became the source of his most painful humiliation. When he finally reached Portland and attempted to visit the hospital where his sister Patricia was supposedly dying, he discovered that no such patient existed. The hospital staff, confused by his desperate inquiries about a patient who had never been admitted, began to question Luke's mental state. His increasingly frantic insistence that his sister was dying in their facility led to security involvement and ultimately a psychiatric evaluation. The revelation that his family emergency was entirely fabricated completed Luke's psychological collapse. He realized that every aspect of his crisis had been orchestrated by the woman he'd betrayed, that his victim had become his destroyer. While Luke's world disintegrated, I began the process of recovering the assets he'd stolen. Armed with comprehensive documentation of his theft and supported by law enforcement investigations, I was able to freeze his offshore accounts and initiate asset recovery proceedings. The money Luke had moved to hidden accounts was traced and seized. The credit cards he'd used to fund his affair were terminated, and their balances transferred to my control. Even the expensive gifts he'd bought Maya were identified as purchased with stolen funds and became subject to recovery actions. Within days, I had not only recovered my stolen assets, but had also gained access to Luke's previously hidden wealth. His attempt to impoverish me had backfired spectacularly. leaving him financially devastated while I emerged wealthier than ever. Luke's return to the United States marked the beginning of his complete social and professional isolation. His friends distanced themselves from the scandal, his family questioned his mental stability, and his former colleagues treated him as a cautionary tale. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and social circles found himself unemployable, unmarketable, and utterly alone. His carefully constructed life had been reduced to rubble by the systematic consequences of his own actions. From my position of restored power and vindicated justice, I watched Luke's final descent with the satisfaction of someone who had transformed victimhood into victory. His betrayal had awakened a strength I never knew I possessed, and his destruction had become the foundation of my resurrection. 3 weeks after Luke's panicked departure from Bali, I received the final intelligence report from Carl. The document read like a comprehensive case study in the systematic destruction of a man who had severely underestimated his victim. Every aspect of Luke's life, professional, financial, social, and legal, had been methodically dismantled by the consequences of his own actions. Luke was currently residing in a studio apartment in a part of town he'd once considered beneath. His notice, funded by whatever remained in his personal checking account after legal fees and asset seizures. His offshore accounts had been frozen, his professional licenses revoked, and his employment prospects reduced to entry-level positions that wouldn't hire someone with pending criminal charges. Maya had returned to her home state, quietly seeking employment while hoping her association with Luke wouldn't follow her. Her social media presence, once a carefully curated display of luxury lifestyle, had been scrubbed clean of any evidence of their relationship. She was learning that being the other woman came with professional and social consequences that extended far beyond the affair itself. The divorce proceedings had been remarkably swift and decisive. Armed with comprehensive evidence of Luke's financial fraud, systematic theft, and planned abandonment, my attorney had negotiated a settlement that recovered not only my stolen assets, but also secured alimony payments that would continue until Luke's projected retirement age. The criminal charges against Luke were proceeding through federal court. The evidence of embezzlement, money laundering, and financial fraud was overwhelming. His attorney had indicated that Luke was considering a plea bargain that would likely result in 3 to 5 years of federal prison time, followed by years of supervised release and financial monitoring. The man who had thought he could steal my money and disappear was discovering that federal prosecutors were far less forgiving than abandoned wives. His attempts to manipulate the system had only provided more evidence of his criminal mindset and lack of remorse. Luke's termination from the financial services industry had sent shockwaves through his professional network. The evidence of his systematic theft and professional misconduct had been so comprehensive that it became a case study in corporate compliance training. His former employer used his criminal behavior as an example in ethics seminars and regulatory training programs. The professional associations that had once welcomed Luke as a member had expelled him permanently. The networking events where he'd once been a respected voice had banned him from attendance. His professional reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that his very name had become synonymous with financial betrayal and criminal behavior. Industry. Publications had written articles about his case, using his downfall as a warning about the importance of ethical behavior and the consequences of professional misconduct. Luke had achieved a form of professional fame, but as a cautionary tale rather than a success story. Perhaps most devastating to someone with Luke's ego was his complete social ostracism. The couple friends we'd shared had universally sided with me, appalled by the systematic nature of his betrayal and the cruelty of his planned abandonment. His country club membership had been revoked, his social invitations had evaporated, and his former social circle treated him as persona non grata. The social media exposure of his affair and theft had created a digital permanent record of his misconduct. Potential employers, landlords, and even dating prospects could easily discover the full scope of his betrayal through simple internet searches. Luke's attempt to create a new life had been thwarted by the indelible record of his old crimes. Through discreet monitoring and occasional reports from mutual acquaintances, I maintained awareness of Luke's continued struggles. He had attempted to rebuild his life multiple times, only to have his past resurface at crucial moments. Job interviews ended when background checks revealed his criminal record. Potential relationships collapsed when women discovered his history of financial fraud and marital betrayal. Luke was discovering that some consequences are permanent, that some betrayals create damage that can never be fully repaired. His attempt to escape his responsibilities had created a lifetime of diminished opportunities and social isolation. As I reviewed the final intelligence report from my penthouse office, purchased with assets recovered from Luke's theft, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport had become someone far stronger, more capable, and more successful than she'd ever imagined possible. Luke's betrayal had awakened abilities I never knew I possessed. His systematic theft had taught me the value of financial independence and strategic planning. His cruelty had revealed my capacity for comprehensive justice. The aftermath was exactly what I'd intended. Complete consequences for complete betrayal. Permanent accountability for attempted permanent abandonment. Luke had learned that some victims refuse to remain victims, and that some women are far more dangerous than they appear. 6 months after that devastating morning at the airport, I stood in my new corner office overlooking the city skyline, a space I'd purchased with assets recovered from Luke's failed theft. The woman reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows bore little resemblance to the naive wife who had planned an anniversary trip to save her marriage. The old Rose had been accommodating, trusting, willing to make excuses for behavior that should have been inexcusable. She had softened her own edges to avoid conflict, diminished her own needs to maintain peace, and convinced herself that love meant accepting betrayal with patience and understanding. That woman was gone, replaced by someone infinitely more formidable. Luke's betrayal had been intended to destroy me, to leave me financially ruined and emotionally devastated while he built a new life with stolen resources. Instead, his systematic theft and calculated cruelty had awakened capabilities I never knew I possessed. I had learned that I was capable of strategic thinking that rivaled military tacticians. I had discovered reserves of emotional strength that could withstand psychological warfare. I had found that my professional skills, properly applied, could dismantle an enemy's life with surgical precision. Most importantly, I had realized that some people mistake kindness for weakness, forgiveness for gullibility, and love for stupidity. Luke had made that mistake, and it had cost him everything. The final piece of my satisfaction came from knowing that Luke's punishment was entirely self-inflicted. I hadn't destroyed his life through illegal actions or unethical behavior. I had simply ensured that the consequences of his own choices followed him completely and permanently. His financial crimes had been real, documented, and prosecuted according to law. His professional misconduct had been genuine, witnessed, and reported through proper channels. His personal betrayals had been systematic, calculated, and exposed through factual evidence. Every consequence Luke faced was earned through his own actions. I had merely prevented his escape from accountability. As I closed the final chapter, on this experience I felt no regret for the woman I'd been or the actions I'd taken. Luke's betrayal had taught me that some situations require strategic response rather than emotional reaction, that some people understand only consequences rather than compassion. My phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn inviting me to dinner, to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of my liberation, as she called it. The date held significance, exactly 1 year since I'd booked that first-class ticket to Bali and begun my transformation from victim to victor. That evening, as I prepared to meet Evelyn for our celebration dinner, I reflected on the unexpected gift Luke had given me through his betrayal. His attempt to destroy my life had instead revealed my true strength. His theft of my money had led to greater financial success, and his abandonment had freed me from a marriage built on deception. Dressed in the designer dress I'd bought with assets recovered from Luke's offshore accounts, applied makeup with hands that no longer trembled with betrayal, and smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in years. Luke was currently serving the second year of his federal prison sentence, learning that actions have consequences, and that some women are far more dangerous than they appear. Maya was working as a receptionist in another state, discovering that affairs with married men rarely lead to fairy tale endings, and I was living proof that sometimes the best revenge is not just living well, but thriving beyond your enemies' wildest nightmares. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport had become someone who would never be abandoned again, because she had learned to value herself too highly to accept betrayal and respect herself too much to tolerate deception. Luke had wanted to escape our marriage. Instead, he had created the woman of his nightmares, someone who remembered everything, forgave nothing, and possessed the skills to ensure that justice was both comprehensive and permanent. Paradise, it turned out, belonged to those who refused to be victims. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.